Hi, everybody. Good morning from snowy suburbs of Washington, D.C. My name's Avi Meyerstein. I'm a partner in Husch Blackwell's labor and employment practice. I focus on workplace safety and health. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, there are multiple application icons for you to use during the program. If you've got any questions during the webcast, you can submit them into the question box. We're going to try to answer questions as we go. Listen carefully. We might just weave it into the presentation if we can. If we have time at the end, we'll try to cover questions, but we've got a lot of material. So rest assured, if we don't get to your question during the presentation, we will definitely follow up afterwards. In addition, there's a PDF of the presentation slides that you can find in the resources folder. This program has been approved for HR and legal education hours. And to report your hours, you just click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. That's about it for the housekeeping item, so why don't we just dive right into it? This presentation has generated a lot of interest, and the reason we did it was because there was a lot of interest and so many questions about what everybody should be thinking and planning about vaccines. I'm delighted to be able to do this presentation this morning with my colleagues, Brittany Falkowski, Tim Hilton, and Jenna Brofsky, and each of them will come on in turn in just a few minutes. So why don't we dive right into it so we can take the full hour for content. Here's just a brief overview of what we're going to cover. We're going to talk a little bit just about the background, what vaccine availability there is, what the distribution plans are. And then we're going to talk about legal concerns that employers should be thinking about, what to consider in your vaccine planning, and what you can do today to start to think and plan for rolling out vaccines in your workplace. And finally, we'll try to have some time for Q&A, but like I said, even if we don't, we will definitely follow up after the presentation, and you're always welcome to follow up with us as well. So what's going on with vaccines? Everybody's hearing about it in the news, seeing the pictures of people getting vaccinated in different places. Just to give you some background about what to expect and how much is out there. The US federal government, through their Operation Warp Speed, pre-ordered 6 potential vaccines. The government basically spent about $10 billion and invested in the development of multiple different vaccines because nobody knew which one would work or which one would be ready soonest. And so when they did that, they pre-ordered 100 million doses of most of those vaccines so that if they did work, the US would be entitled to at least 100 million doses, and then we have the option to buy more. So where we are right now is there are at least three vaccines that seem very promising. Of course, of Pfizer that got approved for emergency use authorization last week. This week, the FDA is looking at Moderna's vaccine. Both of those showed 90 to 95% efficacy in their trials. So very promising that they're working extremely well. And then there are a couple more vaccines that are in trials, and those could potentially get to this same point by January or February. So there's promise for that. But for the moment, we have to think about just the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, and the US has an order for each of 100 million doses. Those are probably going to be administered by March, but we may not be able to get more until June or later. And that's a discussion that's going on. The US actually just in the last day or so was able to contract for some extra Moderna vaccine. So we're looking about probably 150 million people being inoculated between now and June, unless more vaccines become ready or more supply surprisingly becomes ready. Remember, when we're talking about doses, each person needs to get 2 doses. So if it's 100 million doses, it's actually for 50 million people. One of the things that I've tried to help people think about is how much we don't know. And this is a little bit frustrating for all of us because we want to be celebrating the light at the end of the tunnel. But, we really don't know exactly how effective the vaccines will be, how effective they'll be for each person. We know that they can prevent illness because that's what the trials were focused on, but we don't know if they also prevent infection. That's going to be something people are going to be studying. And so one question is, could someone get COVID but not get sick because they had the vaccine, but still spread it to other people? We don't know how long it takes. They think about a week for the vaccine to reach full strength once you've been vaccinated. We don't know how long immunity lasts. You could get vaccinated, be immune for a while, and then potentially it wears off, which is true of other vaccines. And we know of people that have had COVID more than once. We don't know how the virus might mutate and how that will interact with people who've been vaccinated. And this is more on the health effects side, but nobody's had this vaccine for more than a few months. And so we don't really know about any long-term effects. On top of all of that, we also don't know exactly how many vaccines will ultimately get approved and prove successful. We don't know how quickly they'll come online. We don't know how soon the US will be able to get more supply because, for example, Pfizer, they're planning to make over 1 billion doses in 2021, but they've already committed that to most of the world before June. And then we don't know about distribution. We're going to talk about through this presentation some of the things we do and don't know about what the employer's role will be, maybe, what each state's distribution plan will be, and then there are still a few question marks, big ones, about any new laws or regulation or guidance from the federal or state governments. Again, this is just a sort of a graphic to explain the distribution. Now, each state is going to have its own distribution plan. They've already got interim plans, but they have to continue to develop those. For the time being, they generally are following the CDC recommendations that we're going to have a phase one. Phase one is going to focus on healthcare workers, essential workers, people in long-term care facilities, and then eventually high-risk adults, people that have various health conditions that put them at risk for severe COVID, and adults over 65. So that's phases 1A, 1B, 1C. If you look at the first 3 boxes here, when the CDC did estimates, they came up with 20-some million people in 1A, healthcare workers and long-term care, 87 million essential workers outside of healthcare, and 153 million who are in the high risk and 65 and over. Now, some of these are overlapping categories. In other words, there are some people who are essential workers who are also over 65. So the total number is less than this, but let's just say it's at least 100 million, probably more, people that are in that phase one. And so if you think about it going through our current supply of 150 million doses going through spring or June even, we're basically going to maybe cover the phase one high-risk folks. And so most people are not going to start to get the vaccine unless something changes for the better until late spring, early summer at best. And I think it's just important for us all to keep those expectations in mind because we are also eager, but it's still a little bit ways off from the mass herd immunity that we've been looking for. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim to talk a little bit about what the workforce is saying through the unions these days.
Thanks, Avi. Thanks very much to you, and thanks for everybody for being here this morning. My name's Tim Hilton. I'm a partner in our Kansas City office, and I'm coming to you from there, appropriately socially distanced with my colleague, Jenna Brofsky. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're hearing from workforces and some initial talk about what the basic concerns are. So we're going to talk a lot about this throughout the presentation, but this is going to be a controversial issue. And this quote we have here is from a letter back in March, just March of this year. Obviously, a lot has changed since March of 2020, but the AFL-CIO was telling the Secretary of Labor back in March that vaccination is a personal choice and should be voluntary in nature. And there have been polls indicating that even up to a third of nurses are not willing to take the vaccine or have questions about taking the vaccine. So with that, we wanted to get a little bit of feedback from our audience about what your organization's practices are. So we have a poll question here that should be on your screen now. Does your organization currently require at least some employees to get a seasonal flu vaccine? First, yes, we required it and have in years past. yes, we required the flu vaccine this year, but not before, or no, we have never required it. So I'll give everybody a few moments to look at that. All right. All right. Well, the numbers should be up there, and it looks like a very, very big majority. It does not have any current or past practice of requiring the flu vaccine. So that's interesting. I don't know if I think we've got a wide range of companies and employers on the call today, but that's interesting, and I wonder what that number is going to look like in 5 years or so. All right, so one of the first things we're going to talk about are the employer legal concerns, the basic issues that are out there, and what legal issue does vaccination raise for employers. So there's three categories that this basically falls into, and nearly all or some. All employers must continue to protect against the COVID-19 hazards at work. As Avi mentioned, we're all seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's really important, both personally and as employers, that we not let up. So even when the vaccine is going to be widely available, we still anticipate not huge changes to the precautions that you all have been taking, such as social distancing, work from home when appropriate, and then accommodations and leaves potentially when necessary for employees who need them. Nearly all employers are going to have some role in educating, informing, and encouraging employees to get the vaccine. I know there was a lot of interest in today's presentation, and I know I'm getting questions from clients who are getting questions from their employees about how do I get the vaccine, where do I fall in line to get the vaccine, is the company going to provide the vaccine? So these are issues that are going to be coming up to most employers, and you need to be ready to educate and inform your employees about it. And some employers may have an interest and may need to incentivize or potentially even mandate the vaccine. So that's the questions of mandating and how do we incentivize as employers people to take the vaccine is something that we're going to cover in today's presentation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Brittany with the next points.
Thanks, Tim, and hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Falkowski. I am a partner at Husch Blackwell, specializing in labor and employment in the St. Louis office. And what Tim was just saying about having various options available to you with respect to vaccination programs is absolutely correct. As employers are deciding what position they want to take, there are going to be a lot of legal concerns to consider. And this slide just really gives a nice overview of those considerations. I'm not going to get into great depth right now on Title VII or the ADEA or OSHA because we're going to delve into that in this section. However, I do want to take just a moment to address the FDA's Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, of the Pfizer and now Moderna and potentially other COVID-19 vaccines, because we have been getting some questions about this. So really quickly, the FDA emergency authorization is allowing the vaccines to be used before they receive full FDA approval. And the EUA for Pfizer's vaccine is silent about mandates. However, there is this relevant statutory provision that basically says, as a condition of emergency authorization, individuals who are offered the vaccine have to be informed that they can refuse it. Now, this next part is particularly important for employers, and it's that whether somebody can refuse a vaccine is most likely different from whether a vaccine can be mandated as a condition of employment. And so despite that statutory language regarding EUAs generally about the right to refuse, it seems that for the moment, without any other guidance helping us, that employers can most likely adopt mandatory vaccination programs. And if employers choose to do so, then there are these legal concerns at issue. For example, employers need to consider potential religious exemptions. Now, Title VII prohibits discrimination on the basis of religion and requires employers to accommodate religious beliefs unless accommodations pose an undue hardship. That's the basic framework. Now is probably a pretty good time to remind everybody of two things, especially if you haven't had to deal with a religious accommodation issue before. First, Title VII defines religion extremely broadly. It includes traditional organized religions, which I think a lot of us would expect, like Catholicism or Buddhism, but it also includes religious beliefs that are new or uncommon. In addition, religious beliefs can be sincerely held even if they're not consistently observed or if they don't follow the basic tenets of what you would otherwise expect a religion, an organized religion or a more traditional common religion to follow. So practically speaking, what all this means is that if an employee cites religion or their religious beliefs as a reason that they don't want to get vaccinated, then you're going to have to engage in the interactive dialogue to determine if an accommodation, most likely in the form of a vaccine exemption, but also potentially some additional measures that we'll talk about in a little bit, if that would pose an undue hardship, which then brings me to the second thing. And that's that the undue hardship analysis under Title VII, the thing we should remember is that the undue hardship analysis under Title VII is a really low burden for employers. Under Title VII, if the burden on employers is more than just a minimal amount, then it can constitute an undue hardship. And the third point on this slide notes that it could be an undue hardship for some employers to grant vaccine exemptions if doing so is going to impose more than just a minimal financial burden, or if doing so would compromise safety or increase the risk of legal liability. And these are reasons that courts have already cited with approval as undue hardships in other contexts. So before we head too far down this path and everybody on the call thinks, oh great, this is just going to be an undue hardship for everybody, we don't have to grant any exemptions, I want you to also remember two more things, which is that accommodation requests need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. So there's not going to be just a one-size-fits-all approach. You're really going to have to think about your individualized workforce and the people who are asking for the accommodations, what they do and what you can do in return. Second, there's a bit of a trend developing with respect to the U.S. Supreme Court support for religious freedoms, and even during this pandemic. I'm sure some of you remember that last month the court invalidated New York's restrictions on worship services in specific COVID-19 hot zones, finding that those restrictions were violating the right to freedom of religion. And that decision was particularly interesting because, as Justice Roberts noted in his dissent, those restrictions had already been lifted, and so the decision was not entirely necessary. So the takeaway from these two additional points that I wanted to make is just that yes, the burden on employers is low to prove an undue hardship, but you may want to tread a little lightly in light of where we are with the current court system. Okay, so in addition to religious exemptions, employers deciding whether they want to require vaccination are going to have to also consider disability exemptions. The ADEA, which applies to nearly every employer, prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability and requires that employers make reasonable accommodations for employees, unless again doing so would pose an undue hardship. Now, even though that undue hardship verbiage here is very similar to the undue hardship language that I was just referring to with respect to Title VII, the analysis is not the same under the ADA. In fact, the burden on employers is much higher and requires a showing of significant difficulty or expense. And I have actually defended quite a few ADA failure to accommodate claims, and almost never on the basis of undue hardship, because that bar is really hard. It's really high and really hard to prove. What we think is probably more likely going to be part of the analysis with respect to vaccine exemptions in particular is whether an unvaccinated person poses a direct threat to him or herself or to others in the workplace. So earlier this year, the EEOC issued some guidance related to mandatory medical testing under the ADA. And that guidance provided that an individual with the virus, with COVID-19, will pose a direct threat to the health of others. And that's a quote. So for that reason, according to the EEOC, employers could administer COVID-19 testing. And they could do that to employees either before permitting them to enter the workplace at all, or periodically to determine if their presence in the workplace posed a direct threat. And so that's definitely something that our clients have been asking about since April, and that we've been advising on. For vaccines, if you want to extrapolate some of this out, This guidance, again, only related to medical testing, not vaccinations, suggests that employers might not have to accommodate disability-related exemption requests. But, and there's a big caveat, we are waiting for more. The EEOC has not given us any guidance in a very long time. And so for now, we're looking at this medical testing guidance in conjunction with prior EEOC guidance on H1N1 vaccines and flu shots to try to predict what the EEOC will say, if anything, about COVID vaccines. So before Jenna dives into some of those state law issues we previewed, I'm going to briefly pass the baton back to Avi to talk a little bit about where OSHA is.
Thanks, Brittany. So, OSHA also, it's another one of these agencies that hasn't specifically spoken to the question of vaccine for COVID in the workplace. Generally, that leaves us looking at what OSHA has said in the past about other pandemics or pandemics in general, or vaccines in general. And generally speaking, there's an idea that as we look at the law, OSHA could require employers to do mandatory vaccination because OSHA has a general duty clause, for example. You have to provide a workplace free of recognized hazards, and we know COVID is a recognized hazard. But it doesn't seem that OSHA is going to be requiring anybody to vaccinate. In fact, they haven't said anything to that effect. And even the incoming administration so far has indicated they're not leaning towards requiring vaccination. So the question now turns to, well, what has OSHA said about employers who may choose to require vaccination? And a couple things in the last bunch of years that shed some light. First, in 2014, OSHA put out a guide for pandemics. And in that guide, they talked about vaccines, and they indicated that employers should offer vaccines to employees. They didn't suggest that employers should require vaccines. This is all sort of general, broad language, but as we're reading the tea leaves, that's what they said in the pandemic guide, suggesting that employers offer the vaccine. The other thing that they said, and this goes back to 2009 or so with the H1N1 flu, OSHA made a note there. They said, well, OSHA, we're not going to require people to force vaccines on their employees. Employers could offer it. Employers could also require it. However, they said, be careful, because if someone who's an employee refuses the vaccine and they have a reasonable belief that they have a medical condition that creates a real danger of serious illness if they took the vaccine, and you force them to take the vaccine anyway, that could be the basis for a whistleblower by a violation under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. So just like you have concerns about EEOC, potential enforcement and violations, there is concern about potential OSHA violations if an employer tries to push a vaccine mandate so far that they don't recognize, in this case, what is essentially a health exemption request. So something to be aware of. And as with the EEOC and other agencies, we are very eager to see if any of them will issue some guidance to clarify in the COVID example what happens. If not now, then when the new administration comes in the new year. I'm going to turn it back over now to Jenna to talk a little bit about state law and vaccines for flu.
Thank you so much, Avi, and good morning to everyone. I'm Jenna Borofsky. I'm here in the Kansas City office with Tim, socially distanced, as he said. And as a member of the firm's healthcare group, it's worth noting that employers in this industry are not strangers to vaccine mandates. We have a number of states that require healthcare workers or a subset of healthcare workers to be vaccinated. And the exemptions under state law really vary. They often mirror federal exemptions that Brittany touched on, such as for religious beliefs or medical conditions, but states also, a growing number of states also have exemptions for philosophical beliefs. State laws in this area vary in terms of requiring employers to offer the vaccine versus requiring employers to require their workforce to get the vaccine, and also whether to track coverage rates. And we can consider the way in which states have treated the flu vaccine for healthcare workers as an analogy here, at least until we get some more guidance from the states and from the EEOC. And as folks in the healthcare industry know, there are other guideposts we can look to. So CMS for years has been stating that employers should, quote, set an example in terms of vaccinating their workforce. The CDC recommends a range of vaccinations, and the Joint Commission in its accreditation process requires hospitals to educate and offer the flu vaccine to certain licensed independent practitioners and staff, and also sets coverage goals. So zooming out to all employers in all industries, a question we've been getting is, what happens if we encourage the vaccine and an employee has an adverse reaction or a side effect? So there are two concepts I want to touch on today. The first is related to the PrEP Act, which is the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. That was passed back in 2005, way before COVID-19. And it essentially allows the federal government, HHS, to issue a declaration granting immunity to certain entities that are administering the vaccine. That includes what's known as a program planner, which could include those employers who are administering the vaccine. So employers administering the vaccine may fall within this PrEP Act immunity, and the immunity, though, is limited. It doesn't include willful misconduct. So that's the first concept we're thinking about. We'll see how that plays out. The second is workers' compensation. Workers' compensation generally covers claims arising out of and in the course of employment, and that's governed by state law. And so if an employer mandates a vaccine, likely such a claim would fall within a state's workers' compensation scheme. Again, every state is a little bit different. What happens when an employer encourages the vaccine and doesn't require it? Well, there's a multi-factor analysis. Some of those factors that we anticipate courts will look to are whether the vaccine benefits the employer, whether it was paid for by the employer, did the vaccination occur at work? And the last question is meant to get us thinking about other claims that could arise should an employer decide not to vaccinate or require vaccinations in their workforce. What happens when a third party or visitor, especially for public-facing entities, gets COVID-19 and then tries to bring a claim against the employer? So, can you require a vaccine? $1 million question. And we're going to repeat this again and again. We are waiting. Avi and Brittany both touched on the fact that EEOC guidance has not been updated to the vaccine since March, where it simply encouraged the flu vaccine rather than requiring it. So given the numerous caveats we've provided today, we're going to assume private employers can mandate a vaccine if allowing exemptions for A, religious beliefs, and B, health and disabilities, and or any state exemptions. Now, we anticipate employees will raise other objections that are not legally protected, fear, personal beliefs, etc. So we'll start thinking about the practical in a few minutes, but employers can be thinking about the resources and the systems that they need to have in place to deal with these objections that are raised. All right, time for a poll question. Is your organization planning to require at least some employees to get a COVID-19 vaccine when available? The options are: 1, yes, we are planning to require a vaccine. 2, we are considering but have not made a final determination. And 3, no, we are not planning to require a vaccine. So if folks want to go ahead on their devices, make their choice, and we'll see what this group of folks has to say. Okay. The results are in. It looks like just over half, 59%, are considering but have not made a final determination, which seems to make sense to me given the lack of clarity and lack of quantity of the vaccine that's available right now, particularly for the general workforce. Looks like a little over a third are not planning to require it, and 3.4% are, and that may be industry specific. So now I'm going to turn this over to my friend Tim, and he's going to tell us a little bit more. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Jenna. Sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties, so we had to combine conference rooms. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what action steps and what we can do now. So the main points that we are going to look at are establishing a point person or team, creating a draft communications plan, a draft vaccine plans or policy, maintaining the other all the other precautions and protections that you all have been doing since this all began, and stay tuned and listen for updates and changes. A few things to consider in all of these points is constantly monitoring the guidance and the science. As we've all learned over the last several months, this the best practice and the best information changes on a regular basis. And as more and more vaccines come online and become available post-manufacture, that's going to continue to be an issue. If you are considering a mandate, you're going to want to, along with that, consider who in the organization will be subject to the mandate. It doesn't necessarily have to be universal to everyone. You can look at job duties and other things like that. Make sure you have a system in place to handle requests for accommodation and exemption. Again, we don't know for certain what EEOC is going to say about this, but this is always going to be an individualized analysis, and you want to always be aware of blanket rules or inflexible rules. Along with the mandate, consider the consequences of refusal. There are obviously termination being the end option. You're going to risk legal claims of failure to accommodate, those types of things, and also just the risk of losing talent if there are some places that are not mandating and you are. Consider alternatives to the vaccine, such as the things we've been doing all along: masking, social distancing, and work from home. If there is any cost that's going to be associated with the vaccine or the administration of it, consider who's going to pay for that and how to incentivize it. Communicate regularly with employees to build trust and foster engagement. I talked a little bit at the beginning about union environments, but you want to make sure you're reviewing the relevant CBA provisions and consider what your past practice has been with respect to flu vaccines, as past practice is always going to be important in a union environment. So in terms of establishing a point person, your vaccine coordinator or task force or whomever should have the appropriate skills. That's likely somebody who has worked in employee health or in employee relations, HR, and the bandwidth. If this person is overwhelmed with other COVID-19 or other issues, then that's something to consider. Be aware, be following vaccine developments in your state's plan, be continually updating what your company's plan is, because employees, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be coming with questions, are going to have new questions. They're going to want to quarterback execution by coordinating with management, HR, and the workforce, and oversee the communications and coordinate vaccine-related communications. The draft communications plan. This is going to be really important. I confess that early on, I was not clued into how controversial masking and other things were going to become. And I think that vaccine mandates and the vaccine, frankly, is going to dwarf the controversy related to masks. So this is something you're going to want to think about. And you're going to want to educate employees to overcome whatever fears and misinformation there is out there, and just be regularly engaged. You're going to want to have open lines of communication, inviting questions, and two-way communication, engagement with employees on this issue. And finally, on the vaccine policy and plan, a lot of this is TBD. As we talked about at the beginning, this is a rolling out process, and there's going to be phases. There's going to be individual jurisdictional plans. So you're going to want to look to your states or other jurisdictions' distribution plans to consider what your policy is going to look like. All right, well, I'm going to pass it now over to Brittany, who's going to talk a little bit more about mandate issues.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So many of our clients have been reaching out, and it seems like a lot of you are thinking about the same things that they're thinking about, which is whether they even want to consider mandating a COVID-19 vaccine. And while it's certainly not too early to be asking if a mandate is right for your workforce based on your culture and what impact a mandate could have on the morale of your workforce, there are definitely some things missing at the moment. And I know we've been hinting at that throughout the presentation presentation. And it's that guidance that we're looking for that we think should be forthcoming from the FDA or the EEOC or OSHA about mandatory vaccination programs, as well as the state guidance regarding their specific individual distribution plans. I know a lot of states I've seen anyway have, decided how they're going to roll out for healthcare workers, but we're still waiting for their definitions of essential workers when it comes to how they're going to distribute the vaccine. So these are really big unknowns, and anybody planning a mandatory program now is going to have to be really flexible and ready to pivot if and when this additional guidance is issued. But say you are one of these employers who, despite the unknowns, wants to go ahead and consider a mandatory program now. Well, then if that's the case, we recommend first and foremost that you think about the work your employees are performing. If your workforce is largely made up of office workers who've been effectively working from home for the last 8 or 9 months, then a mandatory program may not be worth the hassle and the risk. But if your workplace looks more like a meatpacking plant where COVID-19 outbreaks have been devastating and on the employee population because there are so many essential workers who are operating in real close proximity to one another on a production line, for instance, then perhaps a mandatory program is something you should consider. Of course, as Tim mentioned a little bit earlier, if your employees in that meatpacking plant are unionized, then you'll want to start by looking at your collective bargaining agreement, because you'll want to see if there are any pre-existing provisions that apply to this situation. You'll also really want to delve into your past practice, especially with respect to the flu vaccine, if you have one. Even though COVID-19 is clearly different from the flu, we fully anticipate that unions are going to look at those provisions and past practices as a starting point for any negotiations. Like the FDA and the EEOC, the NLRB has been silent on the issue of mandatory vaccination. So unfortunately, we also don't have anything from that agency, at least not yet. So I know I'm giving the impression, we've all been kind of giving the impression here, that there is a lot of risk involved and a lot of unknown involved with a mandatory program. There's a possibility of it backfiring from a morale standpoint, especially given the experimental designation of the vaccines at this point. But as we get further along and as vaccines become perhaps more accepted generally, it could really be seen as a benefit in your workplace environment. So for example, if employees know that everybody around them has been vaccinated, then they might feel more comfortable coming to work every day. It could also create a really compelling competitive edge for your company, especially if your employees regularly interact with the public, like if you operate a bunch of grocery stores or restaurants, or if your employees perform work inside people's homes, like if you've got cable companies with broadband technicians who have to go in to set up cable, or if you have plumbers or other types of employees who work inside the public's homes, then your company could be more attractive to customers if those customers know that your workforce has been fully vaccinated. So while there are risks, there are really also some potentially great benefits. If you mandate, then that's not the only decision that you have to make. There are also going to be a lot of other decisions that you'll have to make after making that first one. And here are just a few of them. So is your mandate going to apply to everybody in your workforce or only certain segments of that workforce? Going back to the meatpacking plant example, if you're operating a meatpacking plant, then you're most likely going to have front office workers or workers at a corporate campus who won't have the same exposure concerns as the production line employees. And so are you going to require vaccination of everybody and have one consistent policy that applies regardless of what position people hold? Or are you going to only require mandatory vaccination where the risk is the highest? What is a realistic time frame for those employees to get vaccinated? How long should you give them based on vaccine supply, which again, as Avi was mentioning at the very beginning of our presentation, may not extend beyond essential workers until June of next year? How will you account for groups not recommended for the vaccine? We have on here the UK advisory example regarding people with serious allergies, but there's also pregnant employees. The vaccine wasn't tested in that group, and while the CDC recommends that pregnant workers be given a choice to make a decision about whether to get vaccinated, you have to decide how you're going to handle that group. If you want to mandate, we recommend that you review health insurance policies. You want to determine if you have coverage, and if you don't, then potentially call your provider and negotiate for that. You also need to ask, is the mandate something you want to extend beyond employees to on-site visitors or people with whom your employees will interact outside of the workforce? You'll also want to establish a system to track your employees' compliance with the mandate and the deadlines associated with that. And of course, you're going to have to think about enforcement. So earlier, I was talking about the Title VII and the ADEA and potential vaccine exemptions, and Jenna highlighted this as well. And this is why. Practically speaking, why? If you implement a mandatory vaccination program, or perhaps even if you just have an incentive program, you can expect that you're going to be dealing with requests for exemptions based on religion and disability, as well as a host of other objections. I know fear has been mentioned, but there's also political objections, ethical objections. Jenna mentioned philosophical objections, or even conspiracy-based objections. Now, I live in St. Louis, as I mentioned earlier, and the other day I was checking the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services website related to the COVID-19 vaccines. And there was an entire section devoted to rumor control. And I kid you not, there were statements like, the COVID-19 vaccine will not alter your DNA. The COVID-19 vaccine will not have a tracking chip inside of it. Bill and Melinda Gates are not collecting your biometric data. The fact that these statements are even addressed on an official state website tells me that these objections are out there. And if employers decide to mandate vaccination, then they're going to have to decide how they want to deal with them. Right now, what you can do to get prepared for that is flesh out which person or group of people within your organization will make those determinations, what factors they're going to consider, and how they'll communicate their decisions. You can also think about what you'll do if you reject someone's objection and then they go ahead and refuse to get vaccinated anyway. For example, are you going to terminate employment? Are you going to refuse to allow them to step foot on your work site? Or are you going to accommodate those objections similar to people whose objections you've accepted and provide accommodations? So the person or group of people who are deciding that can also be thinking about what accommodations are reasonable in light of your work environment. Luckily, we do have some guidance in this area, some case law that we can rely on to help us understand what courts find reasonable under similar circumstances. Now, prior to the pandemic, mask wearing in lieu of vaccination was a common accommodation for employees who objected to other mandatory vaccination programs. So in the Horvath case that's mentioned on this slide, a firefighter had objected to receiving the Tdap vaccines based on religious grounds. And the fire department, his employer, offered him two alternatives: transfer to a position with equal pay but without contact with vulnerable citizens, or wear a respirator at all times, monitor for symptoms, and get tested regularly to ensure that he was not infected with any of the diseases that he refused to get vaccinated for. So Horvath, the plaintiff in this case, refused those accommodations, and as a result, he was fired. He then sued the fire department, alleging religious discrimination, and the Fifth Circuit earlier this year ruled in favor of the fire department, finding that the accommodations that they offered were reasonable. This case was actually decided in January, so slightly before the pandemic, and it's obviously significant in the COVID context because the Fifth Circuit found that it was reasonable for the employer, the fire department here, to require adherence to both a strict masking policy and a disease testing policy or protocol. So if you apply that to COVID, when you grant accommodations, it may be that the person who you're granting accommodations to will have to continue abiding by your masking policy and get tested frequently for COVID. By now, the rest of the accommodations mentioned on this slide should look pretty familiar to you. They're things that you've already been doing for several months because we haven't had a vaccine in place. And I think that if there's nothing else that you take away from this slide, then it would be important for now to take away the last bullet point. And that's that vaccines are not really our ticket back to normalcy in the short term. Mentally, I think it's going to be very important for employers and employees to prepare for many more months of masks and distance and telework to the extent that's possible. Our firm actually announced last week that we're going to continue our work from home protocols for at least the next 6 months. And so, while that doesn't mean that everybody's working from home, I'm obviously doing so and have been since March. We do have some people on site, but there are a lot of us who are going to continue being remote for the time being because we can afford to do that. So as you all are preparing your plans and considering whether to mandate vaccination, the continuation of the pandemic precautions that you already have in place is definitely something that you want to keep in your plan and that you want to communicate with your employees to set that expectation. Okay, so now I am going to turn it over to Jenna to finish up this section, and then Avi will close us out.
Thank you, Brittany. Much appreciated. So Brittany was talking about accommodations under the ADA and Title VII. And I want to throw in here a third federal statute, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, the ADEA, because it could get a little bit confusing. So the ADEA states that employers can't discriminate among employees based on the employee's age, regardless of the CDC's identification of those who are 65 or older as high risk. So even if an employer is being kind and trying to protect folks based on their age, if that decision is being made on the basis of age, that's not permissible under the ADEA. Unlike the ADA, there's no right to a reasonable accommodation for older workers, so simply based on their age. However, those workers may have medical conditions that bring them under the ADA protections as individuals with disabilities. Would you incentivize? Here's kind of a fun slide for folks to think about. There are big and small ways, if you decide that you want to move in this direction, to help your workforce or encourage them to get the vaccine. The second bullet point talks about allowing employees time to get vaccinated, and that would obviously be in addition to any time that you are obligated to provide to your workforce as compensable time under the FLSA or any other statute. Other incentives include hosting a vaccine clinic, offering points in a wellness program, which should be relatively easy for those employers who already have a wellness program and have offered the flu shot like we do at Husch Blackwell as part of that wellness program. The CDC also says, make it a party, make it a competition. There's printable stickers that say, I got my COVID-19 vaccine. And I'll tell you, I love wearing my I donated blood sticker. So I think that one might go over really well with folks. All right, would you provide vaccines? We've touched on this, a little bit less fun, but some more kind of practical considerations to think about. Do we have a consent form that we're going to have employees sign, or do we want to have a consent form that employees are going to sign before they get the vaccine? And if we're starting to collect this data in a way that we never have before, how are we making sure that it's protected? How are we making sure that medical records are being maintained under employment laws, and that there's no additional OSHA record keeping attached to this new medical information that we as the employer have never been privy to before? And my last slide relates to essential and healthcare workers. And so we throw around the term essential, but what does that mean? I think early on in the pandemic, for the first time, a lot of folks became acquainted with the designation of essential critical infrastructure worker by CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. And that was relied on really heavily by a lot of states when they passed their own stay-at-home orders. But states are not required to use the same criteria that CISA does. And in fact, many have not and have strayed from that to define that term as they need. So it's important to look to your particular state to see who would be deemed an essential worker in terms of prioritization for a vaccine, and also practically who in your company, as Brittany mentioned, does it make sense to vaccinate? If you're a healthcare entity and you have folks interacting with patients, it may make more sense to require or encourage those folks to be vaccinated as opposed to the person who's working in the back office doing the billing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Avi to close us out.
Awesome. Thank you, Jenna. We've got our last poll question. Again, take the pulse and see where people are at. And here it is. Which of the following non-safety employment considerations is the most important to you as you consider whether to require the COVID vaccine in your employees? So several choices here. What's most important consideration? Availability of the vaccine, resources to manage the request for accommodation and compliance, handling employees' fears, maintaining sufficient staffing, or union contract obligations. We'll give everybody just a few seconds to respond and be curious to see where everyone falls out. All right, why don't we see what we got? Okay, looks like a fairly mixed bag in terms of what people thought was the most important consideration. About a fifth of people said it was availability and resources. Almost over 40% are concerned about handling employee fears, and then some about staffing and union contracts. So I think this reflects just how much is up in the air and how complicated all of this can be. So a few final thoughts, and I'm sort of taking one for the team to be the one to convey this one because nobody wants to share this news. I know we're all excited about the vaccines, and I know we all want to get back to normal, but what the experts are saying right now is we should prepare ourselves for a period of what some have called vaccine plus. In other words, because there's so many unknowns and limited availability and how long it's going to take, and we don't know how long it lasts and all of that, we should think about the vaccines as another layer of protection, just like you don't do masks and forget about distancing, you do mask plus distancing. And so from that perspective, a lot of the experts are saying, don't get too comfortable in the idea that you'll get back to normal, because the truth is we'll need to maintain our COVID precautions at least through the time when everybody's getting vaccinated, and possibly even for a little bit of time afterwards. And so, we all hope that could be curtailed, and maybe it will be. Maybe more vaccine will become available. Maybe it will last longer than we think. Maybe a lot of good things will happen. But for the moment, just to set people's expectations, and as employers, I think if people have learned nothing else in the last 9 months, it's that people are looking to business leaders, to their workplaces for guidance, direction, for information. So you do play a role in helping to set expectations. And so do think about this and stay on top of what the experts are saying as the vaccination proceeds, because we may be doing social distancing and remote work and masks and travel precautions for some time to come, probably at least through the summer and maybe a little bit beyond. So with all of that said, we wanted to flag for you that we're not going to leave you hanging. We've had a lot of questions here, and unfortunately some don't yet have answers, but we are working on a vaccination planning checklist, which we hope to share with you hopefully within a few days to the people who participated in this webinar. And we're also working on draft vaccination policies that will work with our clients to customize for each client's workplace. And that too is something that we're hoping to bring online in the coming days or weeks so that we can help you, even as there may still be some gaps to fill or blanks to fill in, that we can help you get as close to ready as possible. Again, for most companies, this is a little bit premature because there's not even any vaccine for you to give people. So we're glad to be helping you think through these things, and we will certainly look forward to working with you and answering any questions you have. And it looks like we might have actually a few minutes for questions. I think we're going to get the band back together here on screen. Try to answer a couple questions that we got in. We've tried to cover these as we went along. Brittany, have you found any we can tackle in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think somebody actually asked an interesting question about consent forms, and I know this was a topic that came up as we were preparing this presentation, and one on which Jenna touched on briefly. But somebody was asking, should we, if we mandate or if we encourage or if we have the on-site ability to administer COVID-19 testing, should we have a consent form and a waiver of liability? I think the answer is that you can expect that whoever's administering the test is going to give some informed consent. It doesn't hurt to also give that informed consent as an employer. And also, if you are actually going to be having the testing on site, you probably do want to have some sort of waiver of liability. Now, whether that's going to be enforceable remains to be seen, but it definitely doesn't hurt.
We also had a question I just saw pop up, and there are a lot of questions, so please do bear with us. We will respond to you directly after the webinar if we can't get to it now. Someone asked about keeping track of who got a second dose and how that's all going to work. And those are the kind of details that are going to be included in each state's plan. They were recommended by CDC to have an entire category of planning around data. How do you track? How do you make sure that people who got the first dose then get the second dose within 3 to 4 weeks? What do you do if people don't show up? So on some level, that's probably going to be organized at the state level. To the extent that any of this gets in the hands of employers, those are going to be things to think about. Is how do you track that? How do you enforce it? And then on the back end, you'll be creating records that you need to maintain carefully and confidentially, and we'll need to look at, for example, the record keeping requirements that could be triggered. So there's a range of complex issues that get pulled in if you end up actually administering the vaccines.
Yeah, exactly, Avi. That's really helpful to note. I think so. We had another question asking, look, if we have employees who can work remotely, then should we allow them to work remotely as an accommodation if we have a mandatory program? And the answer there is probably yes. I mean, if you have a workforce kind of like our own workforce that has demonstrated they can effectively work from home during the pandemic, and that person who is effectively working remotely raises their hand and says, look, I have a religious objection to this vaccine, or I have a disability-related concern with this vaccine, and you go through the process and vet that, then remote work is absolutely an accommodation that you should consider during the interactive dialogue. Sort of interestingly, not exactly the same issue with telework, but there's another case that I was going to mention on right after the Horvath case, but was uncertain if we would have time. There was a case where an employer offered a nurse the accommodation of mask wearing, and she refused to keep the mask on her face at all times. She had, I think, objected on the basis of a disability-related concern, and it was a flu vaccination requirement at a hospital, which is typical, as Jenna was kind of alluding to earlier. And the nurse was continually taking the mask down and saying that it was impossible for her to talk through it and be effective in that way. And ultimately, she faced disciplinary action as a result. And again, that was upheld because the employer had offered her a reasonable accommodation. I don't remember now. I think it might not have been the accommodation that she preferred, but the case law is very clear that it doesn't have to be. It only has to be a reasonable and effective accommodation. And because she failed to comply with that, the disciplinary action could be upheld. So it's just another thing to remember as we're working through this, that there is some precedent we can rely on. Even though we've said a lot about how we're lacking some guidance that we wish we would have from the FDA or the EEOC, there is some case law out there about flu vaccination or H1N1 vaccination that will be helpful as we kind of work through these issues together.
And I also want to emphasize, because there are a number of questions, different kinds of questions about liability from side effects or liability for requiring the vaccine or not requiring it or just incentivizing it. And, there are some open questions about that. There's legal immunity provided through the FDA authorization for those who are part of the mechanism of administering vaccines. And what we're waiting to see and to sort out a little bit is what happens if you're just encouraging but not administering. And, you've got the workers' comp system and how all of that's going to play out. So we're looking at these things. I know it's frustrating to have some pretty big open questions. And, just remember the time we're in, not only this pandemic, but a transition in government coming up that could lead to more or less activity, new rules, new guidance. I think to some extent, we're all going to have to be a little bit patient on some of these things. But as we tried to highlight today, there's a fair amount that you can start thinking about and even start planning to some extent. And certainly for those who are in essential industries or have essential workers, maybe your opportunity to do something about it is even sooner. I think with that, we should probably close because we want to be respectful of everyone's time that they've made available for this. We tried to give a broad overview of a lot of stuff. And like I said, we'll follow up to those who have asked questions afterwards. And we are certainly available to answer questions if you want to follow up with us. This is certainly not the last you'll be hearing from us on this topic. So please keep it coming, and we look forward to the dialogue continuing. We hope this was helpful. As a reminder, the program has been approved for HR and legal education hours. To report your hours, just click on the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast so you can watch and share it. And please be sure to complete our short survey. We really care about your feedback. We want to continue to be able to do this better and better every time. And that concludes our webinar. I just want to thank Brittany and Tim and Jenna for all their hard work and awesome effort. It's been a pleasure doing this with them, and hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season, stays healthy, and has some success in your early vaccine planning.
Thanks, everybody.